Chapter 5. Pluralistic Spiritualism, continued. The system of Berkeley. The problems of philosophy which have so far been considered are fundamentally these two. How many kinds are there of ultimate reality? And what are these kinds? The earliest answer of modern philosophy to both questions is formulated in the pluralistic dualism of Descartes, which teaches that there are two kinds of reality, spiritual and material. But the impossibility of accounting for the relation of two ultimately separate kinds of reality, and the equal impossibility of regarding them as unrelated, lead Hobbes and Leibniz to answer differently the first of the questions, and to acknowledge but one kind of reality, instead of two. In other words, Hobbes and Leibniz replaced Descartes' qualitative dualism by a qualitative monism. To the question, of what nature is this one reality, they offer different answers. The universe consists of corporeal bodies, says Hobbes. The universe is made up of conscious beings, soul-like substances, Leibniz answers. All these philosophers, Descartes and Hobbes and Leibniz, despite their varying beliefs about the kinds of reality, one or two, corporeal or spiritual, nonetheless agree in the assumption that the universe, the all of reality, is, numerically considered, a plurality. They agree, in other words, that the universe is constituted by a multitude of individuals, spiritual and material, or only spiritual, or only material, and Leibniz, indeed, lays a special stress on the plurality of the unique individuals. A radically new movement in philosophy might then be initiated by raising the question: is the plurality of individuals fundamentally real? Or are they but the manifestations of an underlying one, of a single, ultimately real being? But George Berkeley, the philosopher, whose system we are next to study, does not raise this new question. Nor has he any distinctively new answer to the question, how many and what kinds of reality? He assumes, as his predecessors have assumed, that the all of reality consists of a multitude of individuals, and he teaches that these individuals are immaterial. His system is, in other words, like those of all his predecessors, numerically pluralistic. Like that of Leibniz, it is qualitatively monistic and spiritualistic. It has been the fashion of certain critics to undervalue Berkeley's speculative strength, to view his philosophy as the natural attempt of a churchman and bishop to establish the theology of his sect, and to regard his philosophical writings, like his political tracts, as effervescence of the missionary zeal of an orthodox and philanthropic Irishman. A careful reading of the works of Berkeley suffices to refute this estimate. His thought is indeed incomplete, but it is independent and creative. Historically, his system is neither a reinforcement of Leibniz's teaching, nor a reaction from the materialistic pluralism of Hobbes. It is, rather, a correction of the dualism of Berkeley's predecessor, John Locke. The philosophy of Locke need not be set forth in any detail, for in essentials it repeats Descartes' teaching. Like Descartes, Locke taught that the universe consists of a multitude of finite substances, spiritual and material, subordinated to one infinite spirit, God. Locke reached these conclusions much as Descartes did, though the emphasis of his teaching is sometimes different. The most significant of these differences is his analysis of material substance. Descartes had attributed to matter but the one quality, extension. Locke, on the contrary, teaches that the essential, or, as he calls them, the primary, qualities of material substances are extension, with its modifications, and solidity. Furthermore, Locke lays more emphasis than Descartes lays on the important teaching that all other so-called qualities of bodies, color, sound, odor, and the like, do not really belong to material substances. On the contrary, they are, so he holds, mere sensations in us produced by the primary qualities of material things, by the bulk, figure, texture, and motion of their insensible parts. That is, Locke teaches, as Descartes had taught, that real bodies, or material things, are without color or sound or fragrance. They are mere masses of colorless, extended, solid, and moving particles, which produce in us 1. Ideas resembling these qualities, primary ideas of extension, solidity, and motion, and 2. Ideas unlike the qualities themselves, secondary ideas of color, fragrance, and the like. Berkeley's point of departure is this distinction between qualities and ideas. He takes issue with Locke mainly by teaching that even the primary qualities are ideal. In other words, Berkeley teaches that extension and solidity, as well as color and sound, are ideas of the mind. Thus, he reduces the material part of Locke's universe to immaterial reality, and turns things into thoughts, somewhat as Leibniz who transformed Descartes' corporeal bodies into simple monads. 1. Berkeley's doctrine of the reality immediately known, myself and my ideas. It is evident to anyone, Berkeley says, at the beginning of his Principles of Human Knowledge, that the objects of human knowledge are ideas, but, besides all that endless variety of ideas or objects of knowledge, there is likewise something which knows or perceives them, what I call mind, spirit, soul, myself. According to Berkeley, therefore, I know myself in knowing my ideas. He goes on to distinguish the I, or myself, from the mere succession of ideas. I know or am conscious of my own being, and that I myself am not my ideas but somewhat else, a thinking, active principle that perceives, knows, wills, and operates about ideas. I know that I, one and the same self, perceive both colors and sounds, that a color cannot perceive a sound, nor a sound a color, that I am therefore one individual principle, distinct from color and sound, and, for the same reason, from all other ideas. It is important to observe that Berkeley does not seek to establish the existence of a self deeper than its own ideas in any other way than by a direct appeal to consciousness. He holds that each man has an immediate, that is, an unreasoned, certainty of his own existence. And it should be added that whoever denies the existence of himself can go no step further with Berkeley, for every other positive doctrine of his system rests upon the acknowledgement of the existence of the self. The writer of this book believes, with Descartes and Berkeley, that introspection testifies to the existence of such a self, that in every pulse of consciousness, one is certain of a self which is conscious or has ideas. Before discussing in greater detail the characteristics attributed by Berkeley to myself, the subject of knowledge, it is necessary to consider his analysis of the objects of my knowledge, my ideas. This discussion will involve certain rather barren technicalities, but these are necessary to a real understanding of Berkeley, and will form but a brief introduction to the discussion of more vital subjects. Berkeley seems to group ideas, in the sense of objects of knowledge, into two classes. First, ideas, in a narrower sense, and, second, notions. He further subdivides ideas, in the narrower sense, into two classes. 1. Ideas actually imprinted on my senses without dependence on my will, and 2. Ideas excited by me in my mind at pleasure, that is, ideas of imagination. The ideas of sense he describes as more strong, lively, and distinct than those of the imagination, adding that they have likewise a steadiness, order, and coherence. Of notions also, Berkeley recognizes two classes. 1. Notions of our own minds, of spirits and active beings, whereof in a strict sense, we have not ideas, and 2. Notions of relations between things and ideas, which relations are distinct from the ideas or things related. This enumeration of the objects of knowledge may be summarized as follows. Objects of knowledge, ideas, in the wide sense. Ideas, in the strict sense. Notions. Ideas, in the strict sense. Passively received, percepts. Controlled by me, images. Notions. Of spirits and their operations. Of relations. It would not be hard to criticize the summary of the objects of knowledge, for example, on the ground that notions of the first class are not coordinate with the three other groups of objects of knowledge. Such criticisms do not, however, affect fundamental philosophical problems, and need not be pressed. It is most important, on the other hand, to grasp clearly two of the characters which Berkeley attributes to ideas and to notions. He teaches, in the first place, that ideas and notions are, in a way, the copies of something else. Ideas, he holds, are copies of other ideas, and notions are, in some sense, like the spirit which is known through them. This doctrine, as will later appear, has an important bearing on Berkeley's system. In the second place, Berkeley lays stress on the inactivity of ideas. All our ideas, sensations, notions, he says, by whatsoever names they may be distinguished, are visibly inactive. There is nothing of power or agency included in them. To be satisfied of the truth of this, there is nothing requisite but a bare observation of our ideas. Whoever shall attend to his ideas, whether of sense or reflection, will not perceive in them any power or activity. The very being of an idea implies passiveness and inertness in it, insomuch that it is impossible for an idea to do anything, neither can it be the resemblance or pattern of any active being. It will be easier to comprehend what Berkeley means by the passivity of ideas, after considering what he says concerning the correlative activity of spirits. But even at this point of the discussion, most readers will be inclined to agree with Berkeley that introspective attention to the train of ideas reveals no activity of any one idea in its relation to another. This is the view already suggested by Bacon and later developed by Hume. It should also be noted that in the section just quoted, the first in which the subject is considered, inactivity is attributed to ideas in the wide sense of the term, including even notions. Later, when Berkeley realizes the impossibility that a passive idea should resemble an active spirit, we find him limiting the passivity to ideas in the narrow sense. From this study of Berkeley's doctrine of the nature of ideas, it is necessary to return to a discussion of the characters which he attributes to myself, that is, soul or spirit. For to these three words he gives, as he explicitly and repeatedly says, precisely the same meaning. What I am myself, that which I denote by the term I, is the same with what is meant by soul or spiritual substance. The most significant negative characteristic of spirit has already been emphasized, the fact that it has a reality fundamental, and thus in a way superior, to that of ideas. This follows from the characteristic doctrine of Berkeley, the teaching that the whole reality of ideas consists only in being perceived, whereas he goes on, a soul or spirit is an active being whose existence consists, not in being perceived, but in perceiving ideas and thinking. Positively, therefore, this unlikeness of spirit to idea consists in the activity of spirit. This is the aspect of spirit on which Berkeley lays most stress. Spirit is, indeed, never described, except as of an active being or substance, an agent of power, or more simply, as that which acts, which operates. In the ordinary use of the word, therefore, spirit is called active just because it is the knower of ideas, whereas ideas are called passive, since their reality consists in their being known. In a more restricted sense of the word, the activity of spirit is referred to its volitional or creative function. It is no more than willing, and straightway this or that idea arises in my fancy, and by the same power it is obliterated and makes way for another. This making and unmaking of ideas doth very properly denominate the mind active. The mind, or I, is characterized, Berkeley teaches, not merely by activity, but by a certain sort of unity, contrasted with the variety or succession of ideas, and with a permanence opposed to the fleeting and transitory nature of the ideas. I know he says, in a passage already quoted, that I, one and the same self, perceive both colors and sounds. The expression substance or support, of ideas which he constantly uses with reference to spirit, lays stress on this permanence of the self. The epithets simple and indivisible imply the unity. Berkeley further believes that the soul is immortal, but founds the doctrine rather on the traditional opposition between immortal spirit and dead matter, than on any adequate discussion. 2. Berkeley's negative doctrine. The disproof of the existence of matter, non-ideal reality. Up to this point, nothing distinguishes Berkeley in a marked way from his predecessor, Locke, the dualist. For Locke and, in fact, Descartes taught that I may be immediately certain of the existence of myself, an active, unified spirit, and of the existence of my ideas. But closely interwoven with his positive doctrine, that I myself and my ideas exist, is Berkeley's negative teaching, the denial of non-ideal or non-spiritual reality. According to his view and that of Leibniz, the universe is, through and through, immaterial, a universe of consciousness, of spirit and idea. Alleged non-ideal reality is reducible, therefore, either to spirit or to idea. Before discussing Berkeley's argument, it is necessary to define precisely the nature of what he calls matter. According to Berkeley, so-called matter has two essential characters, both negative. It is in the first place conceived as independent of consciousness, that is, of mind. By this is meant that matter would exist unchanged though every conscious being and every conscious process were annihilated. In the second place, matter is other than consciousness, radically and essentially different from consciousness. It is thus obvious that Berkeley uses the term in a sense wider than that of the philosophy of our own day, including under it not merely physical phenomena of the world which we directly perceive, but also whatever non-ideal reality may be inferred to exist. He argues against both these conceptions. The everyday view of matter as some of the physical objects which we see, hear, and touch, and the doctrine of matter as unknown cause or background of our percepts. We must follow both arguments in some detail. A. Berkeley's teaching that immediately perceived material things exist only as ideas. Berkeley's doctrine, that no material reality exists, strikes us at first thought as utterly absurd, for it seems certain that we actually see, hear, taste, or touch material things, trees, thunder, apples, or chairs, for example. But Berkeley never for an instant denies the existence of these directly perceived external objects or things. He believes as firmly as Locke or Descartes or you or I, that the trees and chairs which we perceive really exist, but he denies that they exist outside the mind. In a word, he denies that immediately perceived things are realities which would exist, though no one were conscious of them. Positively, therefore, Berkeley teaches that things are ideas. The table I write on, Berkeley says, exists, that is, I see and feel it, and if I were out of my study I should say it existed, meaning thereby that if I was in my study, I might perceive it, or that some other spirit actually does perceive it. There was an odor, that is, it was smelled, there was a sound, that is, it was heard, a color or figure, and it was perceived by sight or touch. Berkeley has, therefore, to prove that the immediately perceived thing is idea. To do this, it is necessary to analyze it into its parts. A given thing is, let us say, perceived to be colored, fragrant, soft, and round. In other words, it is known as the sum of its qualities. If, now, it can be shown that each of the perceived qualities has no existence independent of perception, it will follow, Berkeley holds, that the perceived thing is itself a modification of consciousness, in a word, that it is idea, not matter. The question at issue is, therefore, simply this. Do we directly perceive colors, odors, and forms as belonging to realities which would exist though there were no perceiver? Berkeley urges that, on the contrary, color, odor, and form as we directly know them vary with the condition of the perceiver. In the three dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, he argues this in detail for the different sense qualities. Suppose, he begins, one of your hands hot and the other cold, and that they are both at once put into the same vessel of water in an intermediate state, will not the water seem cold to one hand and warm to the other? But if, as the everyday theory assumes, hot and cold were qualities belonging to an object existing independently of consciousness, then it would be necessary to suppose that a thing has at one and the same time two opposite qualities, heat and cold. This, Berkeley says, is to believe in absurdity. On the other hand, though an object may not be at the same time hot and cold, a perceiving self may, he holds, at one and the same time have the ideas of hot and cold. Not merely perceived heat or cold, but taste, varies with the perceiver. That which at other times seems sweet shall to a distempered palate appear bitter. And nothing can be plainer than that divers persons perceive different tastes in the same food, since that which one man delights in, another abhors. And how could this be, Berkeley asks, if the taste was really something inherent in the food? Berkeley's meaning is clear. If in tasting food we directly perceive the quality of an object existing independently of us, then the same food must taste the same to different people eating it. But it is admitted that a given food tastes differently to different people. It follows that these different tastes are different ideas of distinct people. Similar reasoning is applied by Berkeley to the other sense qualities. Colored objects change their hue as we approach them. The beautiful red and purple we see on yonder clouds are only apparent colors. They are not really in the clouds, for these have in themselves no other form than that of a dark mist or vapor. And in the same way it may be shown that perceived odors and sounds vary with the perceiver. But all this would be impossible if, in tasting and seeing, hearing and smelling, we directly perceive the qualities of material things, that is, of things existing independently of our consciousness of them. So far, Berkeley has considered only what Locke called the secondary qualities. He has merely amplified and emphasized Descartes' and Locke's arguments to reach this conclusion, that what we know as heat, cold, odor, taste, sound, and color, are ideas in the mind, not qualities of things independent of consciousness. And herein, we must remind ourselves, Locke and Berkeley agree exactly with modern science. The physicists teach us that there is nothing in the physical world exactly corresponding to the different colors, sounds, degrees of heat and cold, flavors, and odors of the nature world as we know it. Colors and the rest, they teach, are mere ideas, and the real causes of these ideas are forms of vibration. Thus the external world of the physicist is essentially the corporeal universe of Descartes and Locke, a silent, colorless world of form and motion. But Berkeley goes on to rob the material world, which we suppose ourselves to perceive directly, of even the so-called primary qualities of form and motion and solidity. For, he argues, the extension, motion, and solidity, which we directly know, vary with the perceiver, as truly as heat and taste and color do. It is easy to multiply illustrations of his meaning. The figures, which are like moving pygmies as I look down at them from a tower, turn out to be full-sized men. The nut which resists the pressure of a child's hand is crushed between a blacksmith's fingers. The trees which glide by me as I am swiftly rowed along the river's bank become immovable when I check the motion of the boat. Now if, in perceiving form, hardness, and motion, I were directly conscious of the qualities in an object existing independently of mind, it would follow that a given figure is both 6 inches and 6 feet high, that a nutshell is both hard and soft, that a given tree is in motion and at rest. The absurdity of such results drives Berkeley to the conclusion that the varying figures, hardnesses, and motions, which we directly perceive, are changing ideas in us. From the fact that as we approach to or recede from an object, the visible extension varies, being at one distance 10 or 100 times greater than at another, it follows, he argues, that extension is not really inherent in the object. The doctrine of Descartes and Locke concerning the physical world, which is, as has been shown, the doctrine of modern science, is thus, in Berkeley's view, utterly inconsistent. According to this familiar way of thinking, colors, sounds, tastes, and odors, the secondary qualities, are ideas in our minds, caused by real material qualities of form and motion. But the argument which convinces Locke that color, taste, and the rest are no real qualities, inherent in material things, is the fact that they vary with the perceiver, and form, hardness, and weight are variable in precisely the same way. They are, therefore, as truly as color and taste, ideas in the mind. There is, in a word, no reason for distinguishing this one group of thing qualities, form, motion, and solidity, from the others. Against this argument, so long drawn out by Berkeley, it may be urged that though unquestionably it proves that the primary qualities are no more real than the secondary qualities, it nevertheless does not disprove that all qualities, primary as well as secondary, belong to objects independent of mind. There is no need of dwelling on this point, for Berkeley himself admits the force of the criticism, definitely stating that this method of arguing does not so much prove that there is no extension or color in an outward object, as that we do not know by sense, which is the true extension or color of the object. But Berkeley has another and a more fundamental reason for the belief that the things and qualities, which we directly see, touch, and feel, do not exist independently of mind. It is this: when I ask myself what I am directly and immediately sure of, in perceiving, it is evident that I am immediately certain only of the fact of my being conscious in this or that way. The very simplicity of this consideration makes it hard to grasp. Let us make it concrete. I say, for example, that I am directly certain of the existence of a red rose. Exactly what is it of which I am evidently sure? I am sure that I have sensational experiences of redness, greenness, fragrance, thorniness, coolness. There is absolutely nothing in the thing of which I am directly certain, save of this complex fact of my experience. I am perhaps certain of more than this, but my other certainties, if they exist, are inferences from this one direct certainty. The material thing then, as directly known, is proved by appeal to the consciousness of every observer to be a fact within consciousness, not independent of it. The thing is, therefore, an idea. In Berkeley's own words, it is an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men, that houses, mountains, rivers, and in a word all sensible objects, have an existence, natural or real, distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. But with how great an assurance and acquiescence soever this principle may be entertained, yet whoever shall find in his heart to call it in question, may perceive it to involve a manifest contradiction. For what are the forementioned objects but the things we perceive by sense? And what do we perceive besides our own ideas or sensations? And is it not plainly repugnant that any one of these or any combination of them should exist unperceived? It should be noticed that Berkeley has so far denied only the existence of those supposedly independent things, which we suppose ourselves to perceive directly, to see, hear, and touch. Whether or not there exist, inferred by us but unperceived, things which would exist, though no one perceived them, and which cause our percepts, this problem Berkeley has not yet considered. He has shown, however, that we have no right to the argument. Things exist independent of mind, for I see, touch, and hear them, that, on the contrary, such things as I am immediately and sensationally conscious of are ideas. Two objections urged against this doctrine of Berkeley's should be considered before passing on to discuss the second of the conceptions of matter, against which he argues. It is urged, in the first place, that Berkeley makes concrete, external things unreal. The real and solid world, of mountains, rocks, and seas, reduces, we are told, on Berkeley's principles, to a mere illusion, to a series of evanescent and unreal phenomena. Thus, Berkeley's doctrine that the thing is idea destroys the admitted distinction between reality and unreality. There is surely a difference between a real dollar and an imagined dollar, a real castle and the palace of our dreams. But if, as Berkeley teaches, real dollar and actual palace are themselves ideas, then no room is left for the experience distinction. Now, Berkeley clearly realizes the gravity of this charge, of annihilating the reality of the physical world, and thereby destroying the distinction between real and unreal, but he very vigorously denies the accusation. He begins by stating the difficulty in terms as forcible as those of his opponents. It will be objected, he says, that by the foregoing principles, all that is real and substantial in nature is banished out of the world, and instead thereof a chimerical scheme of ideas takes place. All things that exist, exist only in the mind. What, therefore, becomes of the sun, moon, and stars? What must we think of houses, rivers, mountains, and stones, nay, even of our own bodies? Are all these but so many chimeras and illusions of the fancy? To all which, and whatever else of the same sort may be objected, I answer, whatever we see, feel, hear, or anywise conceive or understand, remains as secure as ever and is as real as ever, that the things which I see with mine eyes and touch with mine hands do exist, really exist, I make not the least question. Berkeley then goes on to show wherein consists the reality of these immediately seen and felt things, which, though real, are ideas. This reality which distinguishes real things, namely, ideas imprinted on the senses, from the mere ideas of imagination, is, in truth, twofold. The ideas imprinted on the senses have not, 1, dependence on my will, and they are allowed to have more reality, that is, to be more strong, orderly, and coherent than the creatures of the mind. In other words, the reality of perceived things consists, not in the fact that they are independent of any mind, but in the fact that they are ideas characterized by a superior vividness and regularity, and are independent of my own will. In still another way, too, Berkeley teaches that real things, namely, ideas of sense, are distinguished from the ideas of imagination. They are not exclusively or primarily the ideas of a single finite self, but are ideas of the infinite spirit, God, which may be shared by him with finite selves. In Berkeley's own words, There are only things perceiving and things perceived. Every unthinking being is necessarily, and from the very nature of its existence, perceived by some mind, if not by a finite created mind, yet certainly by the infinite mind of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. This aspect of the reality of things immediately perceived depends, however, for its validity on the certainty of God's existence, and Berkeley has not yet proved the existence of God. But he has shown that, if God exists, real things may plausibly be distinguished from images, as existing primarily in God's mind. And, in any case, the involuntariness, the regularity, and the order of ideas of sense give to them a peculiar reality, as compared with ideas of imagination. Be they never so vivid and distinct, however, Berkeley insists, they are nevertheless ideas, that is, they exist in the mind or are perceived by it, as truly as ideas of its own framing. Berkeley's teaching that inferred material reality does not exist. Berkeley has, so far, shown that we are wrong in the ordinary supposition that we immediately see and taste and smell things which exist independently of any mind. On the contrary, we must admit that the immediate objects of our perception are ideas, distinguished by superior coherence and vividness from the ideas of imagination. But this admission does not affect the possibility that non-ideal things do exist independently of consciousness, although we do not perceive them. For it is possible that we ought to infer the existence of things, or matter, independent of our consciousness. This possibility Berkeley, however, denies. He asserts not only that we do not perceive things, independent of consciousness, but also that we have no right to infer the existence of any independent and non-ideal, or, in his words, material, reality. The arguments for this conclusion must now be considered. Berkeley discusses this hypothesis of inferred matter under many names and forms, as substratum, cause, instrument, occasion, and entity. Several of these forms of the doctrine have lost the significance which they had in the 17th century, and all may be grouped under two main heads, of which the second is again subdivided. First, the conception of material, non-ideal, reality as a world of real things known to be like the percepts of them. Second, the opposite conception of material reality, as not known to be like our perceptions. The first of these doctrines represents the least possible concession to idealism, and is a very natural advance upon the theory that material things are immediately known. Granted that things as immediately perceived are ideas, why, it is asked, may there not exist a world of things, existing independently of mind, but yet resembling precisely these perceptions of ours? If this be true, there exists a real world of unperceived yet colored, fragrant, extended things, and our perceptions are copies of these unperceived models of them, these real things. Against such a doctrine, Berkeley urges two objections. In the first place, he points out, this doctrine that there exist real things like our percepts involves us in a new difficulty. Our ideas of the alleged external things are acknowledged to vary constantly, and it follows that the real thing of like the ideas of it must exactly resemble several different ideas. But this is absurd. The real temperature, for example, cannot possibly be both warm and cold, yet according to one person's idea the room is warm, whereas according to another person's view it is cold. In the words of Philonaus, the idealist, to his opponent, Hylas, how is it possible that things perpetually fleeting and variable as our ideas should be copies or images of anything fixed and constant? Even more fundamental is the objection that reality independent of the mind cannot possibly resemble in any significant sense what is in its inmost nature mental, ideal, of the nature of consciousness. By material, it will be remembered, is meant the other than mental. No material thing, therefore, can be like an idea. The opponent of Berkeley has to face the question, how can that which is sensible be like that which is insensible? Can a real thing in itself invisible be like a color, or a real thing which is not audible be like a sound? In a word, can anything be like a sensation or idea, but another sensation or idea? To the writer, as to Berkeley, it seems clear that a material world which is like our ideas of it cannot be proved to exist. But it is still possible, Berkeley's opponent will urge, that material reality which is not known to be like our percepts nonetheless exists. There are two important forms of this conception of matter as inferred reality, independent of mind and not known to be like it. Matter is regarded either, 1, as the cause of our perceptions, or, 2, as entirely unknown. These conceptions must be carefully analyzed and estimated. It may be very plausibly argued, in the first place, that material reality, reality independent of consciousness, must exist to cause my perceptions. Ideas of sensation, so-called things, are admitted to differ from the mere ideas of the imagination, precisely in that they are not creations of my mind, but impressed from without. Thus, it is urged, there must exist a reality independent of consciousness, to cause regular and vivid and inevitable ideas of perception. In the words of Hylas, I find myself affected with various ideas, whereof I know I am not the cause, neither are they the cause of themselves, or of one another, as being altogether inactive, fleeting, dependent beings. They have, therefore, some cause distinct from me and them, of which I pretend to know no more than that it is the cause of my ideas. And this thing, whatever it be, I call matter. Against this doctrine Berkeley argues in the following manner. He admits the necessity of assigning some cause of our ideas of sense. But he points out that matter is not the only possible cause of them. It is at least possible, and he will later argue that it is necessary, to explain these ideas of sense, as due to the influence, on the finite mind, of a mind greater and more powerful than itself. In the second place, Berkeley argues, matter cannot, in the very nature of it, be a cause of anything, least of all, of ideas of consciousness. For by matter is always meant, Berkeley says, a passive inert inactive substance. But how, Berkeley asks, can that which is inactive be a cause, or that which is unthinking be a cause of thought? By this question Berkeley indicates two reasons for denying that matter, as mere unknown cause of ideas, exists. 1. As inactive it could not be a cause at all, and 2. Even if it were active, and thus a cause, as unthinking it could not be the cause of thought. Both arguments demand careful scrutiny. To begin with the second, it will be admitted that matter is unthinking, that is, non-conscious. By definition, matter is precisely that which is other than consciousness. But it is not so evident that a non-conscious being could not because of a phenomenon of consciousness. We know far too little of the relation between cause and effect to assert dogmatically that the two must be of the same nature. In fact, among observed cases of causality the difference between cause and effect is often very striking, as when mechanical causes produce thermal effects, or electrical causes physiological effects. Of course these differences are not so great as distinctions between supposed matter and consciousness, yet Berkeley gives no adequate reason for the assertion that the non-conscious could not be the cause of consciousness. We are thrown back, therefore, to the more general argument that matter, since inactive, cannot be cause of anything. Given the inactivity of matter, this will presumably be granted, since causality in the usual sense does involve activity. But the student of Berkeley will object, fairly enough, that Berkeley has no right to assume, without argument, that matter is inactive, passive, or inert. Modern science expressly challenges this view, conceiving of external reality as energy, rather than as matter. Yet a study of contemporary scientific conceptions will reveal the fact that energy is treated either as motion, kinetic energy, or as further irreducible cause of motion, or, still more indefinitely, as that whose form changes while its quantity remains unchanged. Against any one of these conceptions Berkeley's arguments might be directed. For energy conceived as motion reduces to sensible quality, and conceived as cause, or as permanent quantity, is an inferred reality of indefinite content. And just as Berkeley showed that we cannot perceive any sensible thing outside our consciousness, so, with equal force, he might have argued that the object of our inference is ipso facto an idea, object of consciousness, a mental fact. Thus matter, inferred to exist as cause of ideas, whether regarded as active or as inactive, would still be object of our inference, and, therefore, in Berkeley's language, an idea. The result of our consideration of his doctrine, that matter as cause of percepts does not exist, is then to discredit his express arguments, but to accept his conclusion as a consequence of a truth which he has established. But granting that the cause of our percepts cannot be material, or, in other words, independent of consciousness, there is a final possibility that matter, conceived in a perfectly negative way, exists. It has been shown that color, fragrance, texture, even form and motion, are within the world of consciousness, not independent of it, that even causality is mental, not material. Matter, then, if it exists, has no shape or color, is no form of motion, is not cause of anything. And yet, the opponents of idealism urge, one cannot disprove the existence of some perfectly unknown reality, which is none the less independent of consciousness. The proof just outlined, that an inferred reality must be mental, would hold against this hypothesis of an unknown reality which is neither substance nor accident, thinking nor extended being, neither cause, instrument, nor occasion, but something entirely unknown. Berkeley does not urge this argument, but offers, in place of it, two other objections. He urges, in the first place, that this conception of matter is not consistently maintained by those who uphold it. The philosophers who allege the existence of an absolutely unknown reality are constantly, he says, assuming to know something, however little, about it. And herein it must be confessed that Berkeley clearly is right. Both the philosophers of his time and those of our day, who urge that the ultimate reality must be unknowable, nonetheless claim it as, in a certain way, known. Herbert Spencer, to take a modern instance, teaches the unknowableness of the ultimate, but at the same time defines the unknowable as an ultimate cause, and as that through which all things exist, and this means that the alleged unknowable may at least be known too because If, on the other hand, the hypothesis of matter is unknown be rightly held, if, in other words, it be seriously maintained that matter is that which has absolutely no qualities or predicates whatever, then, Berkeley points out, the hypothesis turns into a mere form of words to which no reality corresponds. That which is neither conscious nor unconscious, that which is not extended, colored, fragrant, or possessed of any sense quality, that which is not active, nor inactive, cause nor effect, that of which no assertion can be made is nothing, it does not exist. The hypothesis of matter as unknown is, in other words, self-contradictory, for if it really is unknown, it cannot be known to be material, non-ideal. So Berkeley concludes, matter comes to nothing. The hypothesis of ultimate reality is unknown yet non-ideal is the last fortress of the opponents of idealism. In his argument against them, Berkeley has long since proved beyond a peradventure that the objects immediately perceived are ideas. He has now concluded his examination of the three conceptions of matter, as reality which, though unperceived, may yet be inferred to exist. And, 1. He has shown that material objects like our ideas of them, may not be inferred to exist. He has, 2. Asserted, what on his premises he might validly have proved, that matter, conceived as mere inferred cause of sense idea, does not exist. And finally, 3. He has shown that absolutely unknown material reality is a mere fiction of the mind. Herewith, the opponents of idealism are, as it seems to him, finally repulsed. The issue between idealism and non-idealism, materialism, as Berkeley calls it, is of such crucial importance that it justifies us in considering, at this point, a form of argument against it, which has grown in importance since Berkeley's day. As will, it is hoped, appear, the objection has already been met by Berkeley, but not in the persuasive form in which it has been urged since his day. In brief, it is pointed out that the physiologists have shown that all phenomena of consciousness depend on nerve excitation, and this, it is urged, proves that consciousness, so far from being ultimately real, is itself a function of a material process. In order to present this objection with utmost force, a passage may be quoted from a materialist of relatively recent date. If, says Karl Vaught, I cut off entirely the flow of blood to the legs of an animal, the function of the muscles is entirely destroyed by the loss of nourishment, the animal cannot move its legs, its muscles are lamed. If I let the blood back before the decomposition of the muscles has begun, the function is restored, but if I do not let back any more blood, the muscle dies, and there is an end to every exercise of the function. Now suppose that we take as object of our experiment not the legs but the head. We cut off the flow of blood to the brain. Immediately consciousness ceases, thought is utterly annihilated, sensation vanishes, motion is checked, every function of the brain has simply stopped. If I promptly enough let back the blood to the brain, motion, sensation, consciousness, and thought return again, the function reinstates itself. But if I wait till the organ can no longer perform its function, sensation, motion, consciousness, and thought are forever vanished, I reach quite the same conclusion in the case of this experiment as in that of the foregoing. That because of failing blood supply the brain could not perform its function, that through continuance of this condition the organ has died, that the function has come to an end with the organ itself. The implication is, of course, that since the brain is material, its function, consciousness, must also be material. Berkeley's reply to this argument for materialism is, in part, suggested in the beginning of the second of the dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, and is in part to be supplied from the general purport of his teaching. Blood and muscle, nerve and brain, are, he holds, sensible objects. In the last analysis, each reduces to a sum of sensible qualities, each is hard or soft, fibrous or cellular, grayish or red. But sense qualities have been abundantly shown to be ideal. Hence brain and nerve are not, as is claimed, material substratum, and consciousness, if described as function of the brain, is the function of an idea. And if it is claimed that brain and nerve are not mere compounds of sense qualities, that they are also the necessarily inferred causes of ideas, then Berkeley might answer that the cause of consciousness, as inferred, is itself an object of thought, and thus within the domain of consciousness. The force of this objection lies, in truth, first, in the highly probable correspondence of one class of so-called physical phenomena with facts of the human self's consciousness, second, in the unjustified assumption that the physical phenomena are ultimately distinct from psychic phenomena, material in the sense of being non-ideal. The grounds for such a prejudice are removed by Berkeley's demonstration that the physical object is itself psychic, and that the distinction between the alleged material reality and the admitted idea must be a distinction between ideas of a less and of a more limited self. To the persuasive form of materialism founded on physiopsychology, Berkeley's answer is, therefore, the following. Brain and nerve process, to which it is proposed to reduce consciousness, are themselves ideal, that is, psychic. 3. Berkeley's positive doctrine of inferred reality. A. The infinite spirit, God. The conclusion that there is no reality independent of mind seems to leave Berkeley certain only of the existence of himself and of his own ideas. But the discovery that certain of his ideas are impressed upon him without his volition, and indeed in opposition to his wishes, has already suggested to Berkeley that some spirit other than himself is the cause of these unwilled ideas of sense. In truth, Berkeley widens his universe to include, besides himself, a creative spirit, God, and other created spirits as well. I am conscious of these other spirits, Berkeley teaches, not as I am conscious of myself with primarily immediate certainty, but because I necessarily infer their existence. We comprehend, he says, our own existence by inward feeling or reflection, and that of other spirits by reason. My own mind and my own ideas, he elsewhere says, I have an immediate knowledge of, and by the help of these do immediately apprehend the possibility of the existence of other spirits and ideas. This reasoning by which we infer the existence of a spirit, other than my own, which causes my percepts, or ideas of sense, is summarized by Berkeley in an early section of the Principles. I find, he says, I can excite ideas in my mind at pleasure. It is no more than willing, and straightway this or that idea arises. Thus much is certain and grounded on experience. But whatever power I may have over my own thoughts, I find the ideas actually perceived by sense have not alike dependence on my will. When in broad daylight I open my eyes, it is not in my power to choose whether I shall see or know, and so likewise as to the hearing and other senses, the ideas imprinted on them are not creatures of my will. There is, therefore, some other will or spirit that produces them. This argument for the existence of a spirit, other than myself, as cause of my percepts, presupposes the demonstration, already given, of the truth that spirit alone is a cause. The argument in full may be summarized in the following manner. 1. I am immediately certain of the existence of my ideas of sense. 2. These ideas must have a cause. 3. There are three, and only three, possible causes for an idea of sense. First, a spirit or spirits. Second, another idea. Third, matter, that is, reality independent of and other than spirit and idea. 4. But matter, Berkeley believes, does not exist, hence it is not cause of ideas of sense, and b. These ideas cannot cause, or explain, each other, since they are passive, that is, dependent for their existence on being known by a self. Therefore, c. A spirit, or spirits, must be cause of the ideas of sense. And 5. This conclusion is supported by the immediate experience which I, a spirit, have of causing ideas. 6. But though it is thus proved that a spirit causes my ideas of sense, I am immediately certain that I am not the cause of them, but that I experience them in spite of myself. Therefore, b. Some spirit other than myself must exist as cause of my percepts. The existence of the sense ideas impressed on the mind is thus, Berkeley teaches, the guarantee of the existence of a will or spirit other than our own. And the nature of the sense ideas is, he holds, the basis for our reasoning about the nature of this other spirit. The creative spirit must be first of all, Berkeley argues, eternal, for only if it is can we account for the continued existence of sense impressions, and their acknowledged independence of any and all individual perceiving selves. Sensible things, he says, have an existence exterior to my mind, since I find them by experience to be independent of it. There is, therefore, some other mind wherein they exist, during the intervals between the times of my perceiving them, as likewise they did before my birth and would do after my supposed annihilation. And as the same is true with regard to all other finite created spirits, it necessarily follows that there is an omnipresent eternal mind which knows and comprehends all things, and exhibits them to our view. The character of these ideas of sense seems, furthermore, to Berkeley a sufficient argument for the infinite, or perfect, power, wisdom, and goodness of that eternal spirit, which is inferred as their author. For sense experience, the sum of the ideas of sense, thus regarded as independent of my particular mind and more permanent than my special ideas, is what is meant by the world of nature. And nature is characterized by phenomena, such as the movements of the stars, or the flow of rivers, so stupendous that only a more than human power could produce them, by phenomena, such as the growth of plants from the seed or of animals from the embryo, so intricate, that only more than human wisdom could produce them, finally, by uniformity and regularity so advantageous, that only more than human goodness could have caused them. If, Berkeley says, we attentively consider the constant regularity, order, and concatenation of natural things, the surprising magnificence, beauty, and perfection of the larger, and the exquisite contrivance of the smaller, parts, of the creation, together with the exact harmony, of the whole, but above all, the never enough admired laws of pain and pleasure, and the instincts or natural inclinations, appetites, and passions of animals, I say, if we consider all these things and at the same time attend to the meaning of the attributes one, eternal, infinitely wise, good, and perfect, we shall clearly perceive that they belong to the aforesaid Spirit, who works all in all, and by whom all things consist. Berkeley, it is evident, does not argue God's existence after Descartes' and Leibniz's fashion, from the completeness of the idea which I have of God, nor as Descartes and Locke had argued, from the necessity that God exists as cause of me, nor like Descartes from the necessity that God exists to cause the idea of God within me. He argues simply that God must exist as cause of external objects. b. Other created spirits. The existence of created spirits other than myself is also argued from my percepts, in particular from my percepts of bodily movement. It is plain, Berkeley says, that we cannot know the existence of other spirits otherwise than by their operations or the ideas by them excited in us. I perceive several combinations of ideas that inform me there are certain particular agents, like myself, which accompany them and concur in their production. When, therefore, we see the color, size, figure, and motions of a man, we perceive only certain sensations or ideas excited in our own minds, and these being exhibited to our view in sundry distinct collections, serve to mark out unto us the existence of finite and created spirits like ourselves. The argument is twofold, from cause and from analogy. I have certain ideas, say, of a moving figure, waving hands, and loud sounds. These ideas resemble others which I myself at times produce, yet I am not the cause of these ideas. I infer, therefore, the existence of other finite spirits accompanying and represented by ideas which resemble those produced by my own agency. Berkeley is at pains to add that the existence of finite spirits is inferred with far less certainty than that of God. For, he says, whereas some one finite and narrow assemblage of ideas denotes a particular human mind, whithersoever we direct our view, we do at all times, and in all places perceive manifest tokens of the divinity. Everything we see, hear, feel, or anywise perceive by sense, being a sign or effect of the power of God, as is our perception of those very motions which are produced by men. c. The world of nature. Berkeley conceives God as creator, not only of lesser spirits, but of the world of nature. Nature is thus, he teaches, a system of ideas, the visible series of sensations, imprinted on our minds by God, which corresponds to the system of ideas eternally present to God's mind. The laws of nature are God's uniform and regular ways of calling up these sense ideas in our minds. In Berkeley's own words, the set rules or established methods wherein the mind we depend on excites in us the ideas of sense are called the laws of nature. And these we learn by experience, which teaches us that such and such ideas are attended with such and such other ideas, in the ordinary course of things. This conception of nature will become clearer by analysis. I may regard the world of nature as composed, roughly speaking, of 1. The sense things, trees, sky, and flowers, at which I am at this moment looking. 2. The sense things, for example, the mer de glace and the pyramids, which either I have seen or have heard described by others. 3. The nature phenomena, for example, the motions of the stars, whose present reality I infer in order to explain the things I immediately experience. And 4. The nature events whose past existence I infer to account for phenomena immediately perceived in the present. To this last class belong early stages of the development of the universe, the whirling of the nebular mass or the glacial epoch, for example. Berkeley regards all 4 sorts of nature phenomena both as immediate ideas of God, and either as immediate percepts, or as ideas of imagination of my own. The first group, that of the things I see, consists of ideas which God shares with me by impressing them on my mind. The second, that of the things I remember seeing or imagine from another's description, have been ideas of sense impressed on me, or on some other finite being, and are now ideas of my imagination. The third is a group of nature phenomena beyond human perception, but inferred as now existing. When we say that the earth moves, Berkeley observes, we mean that if we were placed in such a position and distance, both from the earth and sun, we should perceive the former to move among the choir of the planets. Our assertion that the earth moves is thus our image of the moving earth, and we know this idea of ours to conform to an idea in God's mind, and to be regularly connected with other sense ideas, for instance, with those known as sunrise and sunset. The fourth class of nature phenomena includes the objects which, arguing from nature uniformities, may have existed, we suppose, before the appearance of finite spirits on the earth. These evidently neither are, nor have been, the sense ideas of any finite selves, nor can they even be considered as such. They are ideas of our scientific imagination, and they are the eternally present, direct objects of the consciousness of the eternal spirit. When things are said to begin or end their existence, Berkeley says, we do not mean this with regard to God, but as creatures. All objects are eternally known by God, or, which is the same thing, have an eternal existence in his mind. But when things, before imperceptible to creatures, are by a decree of God perceptible to them, then are they said to begin a relative existence with respect to created minds. In other words, the nature world has a double existence. It is, on the one hand, a closely connected system of ideas eternally present to God, and, on the other hand, a uniform series of ideas infinite minds, corresponding to the system of God's ideas. Of these finite ideas, some are ideas of sense directly impressed by God on a succession of finite minds, others are necessary inferences, ideas of imagination, corresponding to phenomena existing in God's mind, and never directly impressed by him on finite minds. It is interesting to contrast this conception of nature with that of Leibniz. Both Berkeley and Leibniz teach that nature has no existence independent of mind, in a word, that it is immaterial. Both teach also that my knowledge of nature is through my acquaintance with my own sense ideas. But whereas Berkeley teaches that nature consists in these sense ideas of mine, together with a complete system of corresponding ideas in the mind of God, Leibniz teaches that my sense ideas indicate, as the reality behind them, monist soul-like substances, undeveloped spirits. Thus Berkeley argues from his experience of certain sense ideas of motions and bodily features like his own, the existence of created selves. In a parallel fashion, Leibniz argues from all sense ideas the presence of active souls. 4. Critical estimate of Berkeley's system. It is necessary, in conclusion, to attempt an estimate of the positive results of Berkeley's system. It is evident from the outline that his philosophy is essentially a theology, a doctrine about God. Naturally, therefore, the criticisms to be made regard in the first instance Berkeley's arguments for God's existence and his conception of God's nature. A criticism of Berkeley's doctrine about God. Against Berkeley's argument for God's existence, it may be urged that it proves at most merely the existence of a spirit great enough and wise enough to produce nature as we know it. Berkeley's argument, as has been shown, consists simply and solely in the inference that a spirit must exist as cause of those ideas which I myself do not produce. But it is far from evident that a spirit adequate to produce nature should be eternal, infinitely wise, good and perfect. Berkeley argues the eternity of God on the ground that sensible things exist before the birth, and would exist after the annihilation of all finite created spirits. Therefore, Berkeley concludes, in a passage already quoted, there is an omnipresent, eternal mind which knows and comprehends all things. It will be observed that, by this argument, the eternity of God is as sure as, but no surer than, the eternity of physical objects. But concerning physical objects I know only that they exist independently of me, I infer with the highest probability, but I do not directly know, that they are more permanent than my ideas. And certainly I do not know that the series of physical phenomena is eternal. Berkeley has thus a right to argue. Since things are the ideas of some spirit, therefore as surely as objects exist and have existed, when no human self has perceived them, there exists a spirit greater than human, with as great a permanence as the series of things. But farther than this Berkeley cannot go. He cannot, in other words, prove the eternity of the creative spirit, for he cannot prove that there is an eternity of sensible things. 2. Berkeley's proof of the infinite perfection, that is, the utter completeness of this creative spirit, is even more inadequate. He argues, it will be remembered, from an attentive observation of the order, the harmony and the infinite contrivance of nature, that only an absolutely wise and good God could have created them. It is obvious that such a conclusion can be reached only by the most one-sided observation of nature, only in truth by a persistent refusal to regard all that is inexplicable or evil. One may indeed find, in the nature world, order and exquisite contrivance, but besides organs adapted to use there are rudimentary organs which are useless and even harmful to the organism, subordinate to the surviving forms of life, are smaller parts of creation, whose life has no end save destruction. Side by side with the never enough admired laws of the pain and pleasure, which make for physical and moral perfection, are the suffering and anguish, which seem to avail nothing. It is evidently, then, illegitimate in the face of the waste and the destructiveness of nature, the carelessness of type and of individual alike, to argue, as Berkeley does, that the character of our sense percepts evidently shows the existence of an infinitely wise and good God. It is possible, to be sure, that the wisdom and goodness of God may be otherwise demonstrated, and if this can be done, it is certainly true as Berkeley suggests that the mixture of pain and uneasiness which is in the world may be reconciled with the truth of God's wisdom and goodness. But it is a different thing to reconcile the apparent defects of nature with the kindly wisdom of its creator, after that has been proved, and to argue, as Berkeley argues, precisely from the character of the nature world to the goodness and wisdom of God. Such an argument is obviously based on defective observation. 3. A more fundamental difficulty, and yet one which is more readily avoided, concerns Berkeley's conception of creation. The hypothesis of God as creator is expressly based by him on my alleged immediate knowledge of myself as creating ideas. But my creativeness may well be questioned. In what sense, one may ask, do I create ideas? Is there any trace in my experience of that making out of nothing, in which creation is supposed to consist? I call myself creative in certain moments of imagination and thought. But what do I actually experience in thinking out a mathematical demonstration or in striking out the plot of a story? I turn my mind toward the general topic of my interest. I regard the topic steadfastly from all sides. Idea after idea dawns upon me, and, of a sudden, there arrives on the scene that particular idea which I recognize as the solution of my problem or the satisfaction of my aesthetic impulse. Berkeley would say that I create the idea, yet it certainly is also true that I did not make it, that it merely appears suddenly here within my consciousness. But if we conceive the greater spirit, as Berkeley, rightly, does, on the analogy of our own spirits, it will be truer to our own experience to speak of it as the possessor or the subject of ideas, rather than as their cause. Such a rereading of the Berkeleyan conception does not essentially alter it, and indeed contributes, as will be shown, to the solution of still other difficulties. For, a similar though greater difficulty is the inadequacy of Berkeley's conception of the relation of the creative spirit to myself. This conception is never clearly outlined, but the implication of Berkeley's teaching, that God is inferred from ideas which he gives us, not directly known, is that God is radically distinct from us, a God, as it were, outside us. But if this be true, it may well be urged that it is impossible to understand how God can be conceived as affecting us at all, let alone as exciting ideas in us. We certainly have no direct knowledge of such excitation on the part of God. The sense ideas, like the so-called products of our own imagination and thought, simply are here and we are conscious of them. The relation between God and the limited spirits is indeed, in the opinion of the writer, comprehensible only on the supposition that the lesser spirits are, in a sense, parts of the greater spirit, so that his ideas are at the same time their ideas. This conception contradicts Berkeley's, insofar as it implies, on our part, a direct and no longer immediate knowledge of God. But there are certain indications that, in an obscure way, inconsistent with his own main teaching, Berkeley did conceive of God as including, rather than as creating spirit. In one passage, at least, he speaks of God as a spirit, intimately present to our minds, an expression which implies the futility of inferring God, by teaching that he is immediately present. More than this, the double definition of external things, on the one hand, as my sense percepts, yet at the same time as God's ideas, is unintelligible unless God's ideas may be mine, unless I possess them insofar as I, the limited self, am included within the unlimited spirit. Such a conception, as will be shown, does away with two of the further objections to Berkeley's system. B. Criticism of Berkeley's theory of knowledge. It has been shown that Berkeley conceives of knowledge as a copy of something. As has also been indicated, this doctrine leads him to the admission that we have no ideas of spirit. For ideas, he argues, are passive and inert, and cannot therefore resemble active spirit. He has had recourse, therefore, to the theory that one may have notions, though not ideas, of spirit. And yet by his teaching about passivity Berkeley tacitly admits that notions no less than ideas are passive. The activity of a spirit, he himself has shown, consists simply in being a conscious subject, and the passivity of the ideas is nothing more than being perceived. Now notions as well as ideas are certainly passive in this sense. They are not conscious subjects, and they are perceived objects of consciousness. Thus a notion of spirit is as inherently impossible as an idea of spirit. This is doubtless the most serious of all the criticisms on Berkeley's teaching, for it shows that, on his own principles, he has no right to that knowledge of his own existence on which his whole system is based. Berkeley's conclusions are, therefore, rescued only by abandoning his theory of knowledge and by admitting, as already we have seen reason to admit, that one knows at least one's own spirit directly, without interposition of those abstractions, the ideas. Berkeley himself, as has been shown, implicitly teaches that we have this direct knowledge. The truth is that to say a self has successive ideas is simply another way of saying that a self is conscious. But the idea conception, even were it adequate to represent the conscious experience of a single self, is distinctly unequal to the representation of the relations of selves, and should not be employed with reference to them. Love and hate, sympathy and contempt, are personal attitudes and cannot be adequately described as series of psychic phenomena. The conception of knowledge is direct and not mere copy encounters, as must frankly be confessed, greater difficulty when applied, not to my knowledge of myself, but to my knowledge of other selves, God, and finite spirits. The subject cannot fairly be discussed in any detail at this stage of our advance, but the following preliminary and so far dogmatic statement may be made. In being directly conscious of myself, I am conscious of myself as related to other than myself. But, as Berkeley and Leibniz have shown, all reality is ultimately spirit, or self. Therefore that other than myself, which I know in knowing myself is related to it, must be other self, or selves. The characters and extent of such another self are, of course, matters of inference, not of direct knowledge. The difficulty in this conception is, it is needless to say, the following. How, if a self is other than I, can I directly and certainly know it, since that which is given to my consciousness of myself its peculiar certainty is the fact that it is just myself and no other of whom I am conscious? The solution of the difficulty must consist in the attempt to show that there is a certain sense in which the other self is ultimately not another. For if all finite selves are expressions of the infinite self, then in one way each is what the other is, so that direct knowledge of one by the other is conceivable. Thus, Berkeley's copy theory of knowledge, as the mere possession of ideas resembling either spirits or else other ideas, must, it seems, be rejected. For, on this theory, as has appeared, a knowledge of spirit is impossible. But Berkeley has no need of this invalid hypothesis of passive notions which resemble active spirit, since knowledge is no mere possession of mechanical copies, but is, essentially, the immediate presence of spirit to spirit. It would not be difficult to add to these criticisms of Berkeley's system. In particular, it should be noted that the proof just given, that he overemphasizes the idea as such, makes it likely that his view of external nature, as a system of ideas, is less probable than Leibniz's conception of nature as an assemblage of spiritual beings. It could also be shown that Berkeley, in spite of his accurate conception of nature uniformity, undervalues scientific study. It is evident, finally, that he does not critically examine the non-sensuous factors of knowledge. No one of these criticisms, however, affects the fundamental positions of Berkeley's system, therefore, no one of them need, for the present, be emphasized. With these criticisms, the consideration of Berkeley's system is completed. It has been shown that Berkeley teaches negatively, 1. That so-called material things are really the ideas of some mind, or minds, and 2. That matter, as unknown cause or background of these material things, does not exist. The first of these positions, in the writer's opinion, he makes good, for the second he does not offer, but he plainly suggests, a proof. Berkeley teaches positively, 1. That the universe consists of spirits and their ideas, or notions, 2. That these spirits include myself, other finite selves, and God, an infinitely wise and good spirit, 3. That finite spirits create certain of their own ideas and notions, and receive certain others from God, 4. That external nature is to be conceived as made up of the ideas of God, often shared by finite selves, and ordered in accordance with the laws of his being, that is, of the laws of nature. The main criticisms on this doctrine have consisted, first, in pointing out that Berkeley's argument for the existence of God cannot prove more than the existence of a greater than human spirit, and is utterly inadequate to demonstrate the eternity or the perfect wisdom and goodness of the spirit. Second, in showing the unnecessary flaws in Berkeley's doctrine of knowledge. Important contrasts between Berkeley's idealism and that of Leibniz have disclosed themselves in the course of this chapter. The differences in the two arguments for the existence of God and in the two doctrines of nature have already been pointed out. But the fundamental contrast is the following. Leibniz is no less interested in the unique individuality, and, as he holds, the consequent ultimate plurality of spirits, than in their common spiritual, non-material character. Berkeley, on the other hand, though he accepts without question the doctrine that ultimate reality consists of a plurality of distinct spirits, does not emphasize or concern himself greatly with this doctrine and its implications. But Berkeley makes a distinct advance upon Leibniz in the strength and detail of his argument against materialism. Leibniz asserts the unreality of alleged matter, but he nowhere adequately substantiates his conclusions. Berkeley, on the contrary, devotes himself to the painstaking refutation of the claims of materialism. Yet the most significant of Berkeley's positive results is, as has been said so often, no other than the most important of Leibniz's conclusions: the conception of the universe as a community of spiritual beings.